Before that, though, let me tell you about teenage drivers. Should they be allowed to have passengers in the car that are also teenagers? Let's talk to Nathaniel Ogunniyi and also Elizabeth Box, who've got varying views on that. Should teenagers be allowed to drive teenagers?
Well, we've been looking at this issue at the RAC Foundation for over the last 10 years, and there's been research over the last 30 years. And what we know is that teenagers are really, really at risk within that first 6 to 12 months after they initially pass their test, and 17 to 19-year-olds are even higher at risk. So when they take... Why? There's two things, really. It's age and experience. So we know that young people have got developing brains, so they're much more likely, up until almost mid-25, actually, to be more likely to take risks, to be impulsive. And that's just a fact of a biological fact. And they just don't have the experience on the road. So we know that if they take one more passenger in the vehicle, they're twice as likely to crash. 3 passengers, 3 times as likely to crash. So we've been looking at what might be a proposal that could really help this age group. And we think this is the kind of right balance, because it's really important to have mobility, but we also want that mobility to be safe.
Sounds conclusive, Nathaniel.
No, I don't think so. So I think there are a few things here. First, that correlation is not causation. So you may look at the numbers and say it looks that way, but actually, in reality, that's not necessarily the case, right? I think there was a study done on chocolate and IQ saying that people who eat more chocolate are smarter. That doesn't mean we should go around prescribing Cadbury's. I think there's a point about isolating young people. So I play for a local rugby club. Before I learned to drive, people gave me a lift there, you know. If I couldn't get lifts there, then I wouldn't have been able to go. And so there's a point about isolating young people. I think the government have looked at this several times over the last few years. They looked at it most recently in 2020 and concluded that it would isolate young people. It was not good for their leisure prospects. It was not good for their work prospects. I think it makes life really difficult for young people who've given a lot over the last few years.
Elizabeth?
Well, I mean, I think those are all really valid concerns. As I say, at the RAC Foundation, we're really keen that young people have mobility. I think the key thing about this proposal, in other countries, it's much more severe, the things that they can put in place. And the key thing about this proposal is young people between the ages 17 to 19, once they pass their driving test, they can drive themselves. So they can get themselves to work, they can get themselves to education. And it's for a 6-month period that they can't take their friends. And obviously, that will have an impact, but we feel, given this proposal will save up to 44 lives a year and 537 killed or seriously injured people, we feel like it's the right balance and helps young people develop that really crucial skills that they need to develop in a safe environment on their own before they have their friends in their car for the first 6 months.
So if it could save injury or death for 10 kids a week, isn't it worth trying?
But it's not clear it would, right? When we look at the evidence, again, it's about correlation and causation, and they're not the same thing. So I think it's one thing to say these proposals might or could, but there's no evidence that these actually work. And of course, the government have looked at this before, and there's a reason that they rejected those proposals in 2020. There's a reason that they've rejected all of this evidence going back at maybe 10, 15, 20 years, because, again, they've looked at these measures and they don't necessarily work.
Well, I have to disagree, just because there's 30 years of evidence from countries across the world. It's not an issue of correlation. We know that this is an effective policy. Throughout other countries, it can save up to 40% of collisions involving young and novice drivers. So we know this is a policy that works. So, yeah, there is really good evidence for it.
I think it works at isolating young people. I think it works at stopping them from getting to, you know, as I said, rugby or work or other commitments that they may have. But it doesn't work in terms of saving their lives.
Elizabeth says she's got evidence to prove that it can.
But I don't think it does. I think you've just confused correlation with causation. I think the studies look at what the numbers might suggest. But again, because something is more prevalent in a certain age group, that doesn't mean that, for instance, carrying passengers or driving after a certain time is the cause of those accidents. What I think the government need to focus on, instead of measures like this, is cutting down the waiting lists. So, for instance, over the pandemic, there were 1.2 million driving tests that were cancelled. The waiting lists are still about 6 months long in London. You get young people paying up to £250, which is a lot of money. £250 for a young person to pay for a driving test is a lot of money. And you get people paying those amounts simply because they can't get a driving test to pass.
So I'm a behavioural psychologist. I've got a PhD in transport psychology. I need to stress that the evidence is international and it's irrefutable in terms of what some researchers have said is if governments don't have this rule in place, it's actually a weak law. Because what we really need to do is protect young people at this really vulnerable stage where they need to develop their experience. So I really need to stress to listeners that there is really good evidence for this. I think your concerns about what it means for young people are really valid, but we have to kind of balance up those two things. So the proposal that we've put on the table is essentially 6 months minimum learning period so that you can kind of get that experience you need, and then a 6 months minimum period where you don't carry any passengers. And if you don't do that, then you would go back to L plates and have 6 penalty points. So what we wanted to do is make it really clear and to make it as least effect as we possibly could on young people, but also while saving lives. So this, we think, is a proportional response to the really serious issue. I mean, road traffic collisions are the biggest killer of young people worldwide. We know that they are going to struggle in certain environments. We need to have laws in place that can help parents talk to their young people about the risks they're going to face when they're in the vehicle for the first time with their peers.
OK, final thought to you, Nathaniel?
Yes, I don't think these proposals will save lives. I don't think the evidence is strong enough, and I don't think enforcement is easy either. So, do you have police officers pulling people over saying, "Oh, I think you look a little bit too young to be driving someone," or "How long have you had your driving licence for?" I think enforcement is really important in the law, and it'll be very difficult to do that for this.
OK, we are out of time, sadly. Interesting debate, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.